Welcome to the Pat Conroy Literary Center for our night of stories. Dr. Malphrus. My name is Madison Hayes. I'm one of the interns here, pretty brand new, and I'm mainly here to introduce our speaker for the night, the lovely Dr. Ellen Malphrus. I'm also a student of hers. I'm sure many of you here have spoken with Dr. Malphrus in the past and known Dr. Malphrus and know how amazing she is, not only as a storyteller and a writer and as a teacher, but also as someone who can talk about history and talk about Pat Conroy on such a unique and close perspective. So without further ado, Dr. Malphrus.
Thank you, Madison. Those of you who frequent the center will get to know Maddie better, and those of you who are readers will note this name, Madison Hayes, because it won't be the last time that you hear it. Two very talented students with us tonight. So, we're going to talk about a book tonight that you have obviously heard of. For how many of you is this the favorite Conroy book? Okay. The title of this book is not My Summer in New York. The title of this book is not After Hours on the Counselor's Couch. The title of this book is The Prince of Tides. How many of you have read it recently? How many of you read it or getting ready for this? Had it been a while since you read?
Yes.
Did you remember how intense it was? Page after page after page. It's unrelenting. It's unrelenting. The Prince of Tides. And so those of you who've read recently remind me, who is the Prince of Tides?
Luke.
Luke. Right? Luke. This is a book about circles. Circles are something important to Pat Conroy in his writing, in his life. It's something that we talk about a lot, those of us who are in positions to talk about Pat and his work from time to time. If you look at the very end of the book, the last say, almost, is Savannah. This is almost bitter end. On page 566, a few words from what ought to be the end of the book. And she says, I'm going to make it, Tom. Then, looking at the sun and the moon again, she added, wholeness, Tom. It all comes back. It's all a circle. Right? So this, and then, let me go ahead and just say this. That should be the end of the book. Okay? And Conroy even says so. We have, with those words of Savannah's, that should be the end of it. But it is not. Okay? That's Pat Conroy messing with us. That's Pat Conroy who, before this book came out in 1986, had already published 3 novels that had already become 3 full-length feature films. And Pat had learned a thing or two about Hollywood. This is the first grown-up book Pat wrote. This is the first book that involved sex and a love story, those kinds of themes that we had not seen in The Water is Wide and The Great Santini and The Lords of Discipline. And so when Conroy says that ought to be the end of it, but then he tosses in this cheesy little paragraph about Lowenstein, I know in my heart of hearts that he knew that Hollywood would love that stuff. And indeed, that's what we have. We have that as the sign-off. But we readers know that this is a book about family, and more specifically, it's a book about siblings. This is a book about the twins of Bathsheba, who were born during that hurricane, and their brother Luke, who not even 1 year old, who kept them, you might argue, alive when Sarah dies. Their mother is passed out at death's door. Sarah Jenkins passes on, and it's Luke's little body nestled into theirs that is the comfort for them through that first night of their lives, and that continues to be the comfort for them throughout their lives. That circle, that link, that beautiful image that doesn't come until late in the novel itself. It's one of the opening things that you see in that film, of the three of them holding hands and going down. I want to look at that passage because I love that passage. It is on page 380. And I'm going to read a bit of it. There was one ritual we developed. This is the three young widows. When we were very small, that we revealed to not another living soul. Whenever we were hurting or damaged or sad, whenever our parents had punished or beaten us, the three of us would go to the end of the floating dock, dive into the sun-sweet water, then swim out 10 yards into the channel and form a circle together by holding hands. We floated together, our hands clasped in a perfect, unbreakable circle. I held Savannah's hand and I held Luke's. All of us touched, bound in a ring of flesh and blood and water. Luke would give a signal and all of us would inhale and sink to the bottom of the river, our hands still tightly joined. We would remain on the bottom until one of us squeezed the hands of the others, and we would rise together and break the surface in an explosion of sunlight and breath. But on the bottom, I would open my eyes to the salt and shadow and see the dim figures of my brother and sister floating like embryos inside me. I could feel the dazzling connection between us, a triangle of wordless, uplifted love as we rose, our pulses touching toward the light and terror of our lives. Diving down, we knew the safety and silence of that motherless, fatherless world. Only when our lungs betrayed us did we rise up toward the wreckage. So that unity that goes unbroken all their lives until Luke is killed, through everything, through the abuses, through the degradation, through everything, there is Luke, who is the stalwart prince. There is Luke, who is, you guys know Joseph Campbell? The hero with 1,000 faces? If you don't know it, please get to know it. Joseph Campbell was our leading world mythologist. He went on ahead several decades ago now. But he writes about this monomyth of the hero quest, which is played out in this book so beautifully with Luke Wingo as the hero. But very, very, very briefly, the hero gets the call, or the call is thrust upon the hero. The hero sets out on his or her hero quest. There are dragons to slay along the way. There are helper figures. There must be a delving into the deep belly of the whale where darkness is battled, and eventually the hero rises again and must assimilate back into society, if that is possible. Every one of us is on a hero quest. Campbell tells us this. You've survived birth and the quest begins, and each of us is on this quest. Some of us, through history in our lives, are more elevated, let's say, in their hero quest. Luke Wingo is one of these. When you take Joseph Campbell's tenets of the hero quest, you can come through this book and you can write a scholarly paper on it, which Ellen Malphrus did. It was published in the the Southern Literary Journal a few years back. I did this in honor of Pat. I did this for Pat. I did this because I believed and still believe there is not enough critical material out there on Pat Conroy's work. I believe that his work merits far more scholarship than has been written about it. But this, you see, is what happens very often with academics such as I, who trounce upon the notion that writers who are great commercial successes can have anything worth writing about in serious academic ways. I think there's lots to be written about in Pat Conroy. And because archetypal scholarship is something that I enjoy, and because I saw it so readily in this with Joseph Campbell and that monomyth, I focused on Luke Wingo, the Prince of Tides, as the hero. And when we're done with this, I'll direct you how to go read up. You who are aficionados of the Prince of Tides might be interested to check that out. But so Luke is the one. Each of the three of them, and remember, they're that close in age. It's not like Luke is the great big brother. He is slightly older. Once they go through that ordeal in Atlanta with Callenwold, when they were children, Luke, no doubt because of all that they are dealing with, and because Luke is the man of the house, it goes without saying. Henry goes back to Korea. Luke is left as the man of the house. It is Luke who bears the brunt of the burden, emotionally and otherwise, of this horror that has come into their lives. And obviously the kid missed so much school that he failed second grade. And so throughout their growing up period, the three of them were in class together, grew up together. It was Luke from the outset. It was Luke who at Stone Mountain stood up to the tyrant figure, Henry Wingo, when he's beaten on Tom and then beaten on Lila, as he is wont to do. It's Luke, you recall, who stands up with the knife, right? The hero of the shining blade, Campbell writes about it, okay? That it's Luke who is able to act. That same year, he's 7 years old. Maybe he's turned 8 by then, in Atlanta. When Callenwold is trying to get into the house, it's Luke who picks up the poker and does something about it. When he comes back, it's finally Luke who is able to get rid of him with the Black Widow spiders. Luke who can act. Tom, you will recall, is petrified, is frozen. He tells us this. He cannot act. Savannah goes ballistic. It's Luke who steps up and does it. It's Luke who, when these twins turn 10, and Henry can't be bothered to come sing Happy Birthday. Remember that nice family scene? Oh, yeah. Kind of like watching Leave It to Beaver. You know? Sure. And when Henry once again engages in this intense physical abuse, it's Luke who takes the handgun and blasts the TV 6 times and says in that wonderful dark humor, well, I guess you can sing to your children now, or words to that effect, I guess, you know. Don't have to be tuned into the TV right now. It's Luke who is the one in those years, 52 to 56, or 54 to 58, whenever it was, when there were 4 stillborns, bam, 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 one every year, that are put in the freezer until Lila can get home from the hospital to have buried them. It's Luke, the one who has the wherewithal to keep himself together through this. And on and on and on. Luke is the one who acts. When let's fast forward to Lila has sold them out towards the end of the book. The Colleton nuclear thing is coming. She has sold out Melrose Island. The whole community is being sold out. It is Luke who acts. It is Luke who initially engages in verbal activism, trying to make a stand, trying to convince these people that this place is worthy of fighting for. This beautiful place where we sit right now, you know, Pat's calling it other names, but we know that we are where this book is set. It's Luke who makes the stand. It's Luke who then amps up the activism. Luke who was the Navy SEAL. Luke who knows these tactics. Luke who has endured what he did in Vietnam in order to ensure that he could come back to the low country of South Carolina and live out his days in what he deemed to be the Garden of Eden that is now being robbed from him and everyone. But nobody does anything about it. They go along like sheep. Luke tries to make a stand. Sadly, heartbreakingly, Luke seals his own fate when he doesn't know that train is coming, that unscheduled train that causes 4 men to lose their lives, and Luke's life is over then. But he lives those last days as one gone back in time. He lives in Eden on Melrose Island and in those environs. And when Savannah and Tom come to him and tell him they've made that deal with the FBI, and Luke says, sure, I'll be on ahead. Luke knows he won't. He's already told us that he would rather die than go to jail when Sally suggests that he be a conscientious objector and not go to Vietnam. He's already told us he'll never do that. We know he won't do that. And so there at the home place, on the foundation of his family home, he is gunned down as he visits for the last time the grave of his beloved Caesar. Takes flowers to take there. And so this happens. Luke dies, and Savannah and Tom, for the first time, fall apart. 3 days after Luke is killed is Savannah's first suicide attempt. Tom's nervous breakdown comes in the wake of Luke's demise. Not the repeated, every year of their lives, physical, emotional abuse. Not the culmination following their senior year in high school when they're all at the precipice of heading out into the wide world. Savannah off to New York and Tom up to Carolina to play football, and Luke getting his shrimp boat, and the world about to open to these three who have survived their childhood. August 3rd, in the dog days, comes the knock at the door. Callan Walt and the other two. And that day of horrors that ends with 3 rapes and 3 killings, and not just killings, but one with a Bengal tiger soaring through the door to take one man's head off, and Luke with the marble statue of Jesus decapitating his rapist and beating his head to an unrecognizable puddle of bone and blood, and Savannah blowing her rapist in half with a shotgun. And then poor Caesar, who is sacrificed, his death, and the cleaning up of it all, and the burial of 3 guys, and the getting ready for Henry to come home for supper. None of these things have been the breaking point for Savannah and Tom. It is the death of their brother, Luke, the Prince of Tides, that has broken the circle and that has broken them. And then we come to the opening of this book. This is how the book opens, right? We get the call that Savannah's had another suicide attempt. Tom is going to New York to take on his role of chivalric brother come to save sister. It's obviously himself who needs saving as well. Tom and Savannah are on their own hero quests, right? As are we all, but you can certainly trace this hero quest in them very, very easily. Prince of Tides, this boy from Colleton who was so connected to this place, as connected to the low country of South Carolina as Arthur was to Camelot. And I don't know how long it's been since you brushed up on your Camelot, but in Mallory's version, there is that scene at the end where Belvedere is easing his king out to sea, right? Just as Savannah and Tom have taken Luke 3 miles out past the 3-mile marker to bury him at sea. And Belvedere says to King Arthur, "What shall I do? How can I go on?" And Arthur's counsel to him is basically, heal yourself, console yourself. And so this is what we find at novel's end. We find that Tom is able to say to his sister, who has gone through this last bout, who has made it out of the belly of the whale, again, we have to say Luke's name. We have to learn to honor him, make him live in your work. I, through my memory of him, but we, he is saying, just as Belvedere must heal himself, those two must now come up from out of the water. There's not the 3 of them to hold hands anymore, but the 2 of them are going to have to bring the circle back together, hold each other's hands, and come up with Luke in their hearts, with Luke there with them, and not denying the death, not repressing the death, as they have been so schooled, so well trained all their lives to do. Shut it down. So, let's see how long I rattled on there. Okay, so I can say a whole lot about this book and talk about it, segue into it from so many different angles. But I want us to stop this just me, and let's open it up to ways that you'd like to talk about it, questions that you have. Hang on one second. I know that one thing we could do, those of us who are from around here, is talk about how personal this book is to so many of us, and the stories that so many of us do know. Carolina Snowball. How many of you grew up knowing about Carolina Snowball? Well, my uncle was a shrimper, so there was an albino dolphin in these waters in Port Royal Sound, and I grew up knowing about that. How about any South Carolinians who went to see Happy the Tiger at the Esso station on Gervais Street in Columbia? Okay, well, that's where that came from. There was, at the Esso station on Gervais, until Riverbank Zoo opened, Happy the Tiger, pathetic creature, lived in that cage. And you can bet that when kids got to go to the state capitol, they hacked their mom and daddy to take them to see Happy the Tiger at the Esso station. Tutti Frutti. Now, some of you Beaufortonians must remember Tutti Frutti, who comes as Mr. Fruit in the book. Tutti Frutti, who enlivened and brought joy to so many lives for so long in Beaufort, leading the parade, blowing his whistle, escorting people across the street. Tutti Frutti only died in 2013. He's not been gone from us very long. So there are these characters, these places that so many of us, and then the filming of the movie, right? I'm sure many of us have these little anecdotes to tell. So I'm saying that to say, I don't know how much time we want to spend with that, how much time we want to focus on the book itself, but let's hear. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to ask? Yes?
Did Pat have much say in who would be cast in the movie?
Kathy? Did Pat have much say in who would
listened to you for 5 hours.
Me too.
Okay, it's
Ditto.
wonderful hearing your perspective. This is a very esoteric question. I reread the book in anticipation of coming. I hadn't read it for about too many years. And I was really struck by The Southern Way, the book that Savannah wrote. That was not a children's story in my estimation. I mean, why?
Pat Conroy's first, quote, children's book, right?
Yeah.
That is, of course, the retelling of that horrid day of the rapes and killings, but of course, Savannah, entitling this book, The Southern Way, this is when Savannah has taken on Renata as her,
Halpern.
Halpern, thank you, Halpern. This woman who existed and who was Savannah's friend and who helped Savannah get through a bad patch and who then threw herself in front of a train. And Savannah is taking on her identity and thinks that she's going to flee herself by doing this and moving to the West Coast or something. And so she publishes this book called The Southern Way that is this retelling that is, yes, a very dark, and one is very curious, isn't one, reading this book. In this novel, The Prince of Tides, there is that text of The Southern Way written by Savannah, a.k.a. Halpern, published, I believe, by Random House, wasn't it? So there's a readership for this book, but yes, you must wonder how this book was marketed, and yes, what parents would have their children read this. It's not just Grimm Brothers dark, it's
very dark.
It's dark as in very much an adult piece of writing. So I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I just kind of wondered if when Pat was writing, he just didn't know how to bring that story forward in the book. You know, if it was something he struggled with, and I don't know if in your conversations with him you might have had any discussion about that, because reading it the second time, I was like, wow. You know, it didn't strike me that strange when I read it the first time, but
Yeah.
with some life experience behind me.
That is a mystery to me as well. That is a mystery. So The Shrimper's Daughter was Savannah's first book of poetry. The Prince of Tides, Savannah's second book of poetry. So there's this kind of, you know, frame tale sort of thing here, where in this novel entitled The Prince of Tides, we have this poet who has written a book entitled The Prince of Tides. By the way, one thing that I wanted to make certain to say to you, which is the reason I knew I wanted to write about, when I wanted to write a scholarly article about Pat's work, I knew I wanted to write it on The Prince of Tides. It's the first book of Pat's that I read. I was not long out of college when this book came out, and it was incredibly impactful on me as a Low Country native, as an English major, as a young wannabe writer. Basically what it did is cause me to think, I'll never be able to do that. I will never be able to do that. And it was years, and it was with Pat Conroy's help, Pat Conroy, who had then become my friend, who had become my mentor, who had encouraged me, that this book that Pat Conroy wrote forward for, then Pat would want me to tell you there are copies available for sale. This book wouldn't exist if it weren't for Pat's encouragement. Further, this book wouldn't exist. There's one of those circles in my life that connects me to Pat Conroy, has to do with this guy, James Dickey, who wrote Deliverance. You've heard of this book. Pat was a student of his. I was a student of his. It's the connection that caused Pat and I to become close friends, not just friends. Okay? Part of the circle has to do with books everywhere. This guy Ron Rash, you've heard of him? If you haven't heard of him, hear of him. Get thee to your local bookseller and buy, I would start with One Foot in Eden. There was a Dickey conference some years back in Columbia, South Carolina. Sandra, Pat's darling wife, Cassandra King Conroy, couldn't go. So Pat asked me to go and be his date for the weekend. And we were all staying on campus in Columbia at the inn. And Pat said, the first night, I want you to come down for breakfast tomorrow. There's somebody I want you to meet. Mr. Big. That's what he calls Ron Rash. And so Pat Conroy literally introduced me to Ron Rash. And I read this, Ron's first book. Well, guess what? This book deals with the same kinds of things that this book deals with. I never thought anybody would take on the kinds of things that deliverance does about damming a river and all the repercussions of that. Ron Rash writes about it in One Foot in Eden, and this book was my liberation to say, oh, wow, maybe you can, Ellen. Maybe you can write about the low country of South Carolina. Maybe there's room enough for somebody else, right, besides Pat Conroy to write about. Okay, so I knew I wanted to do this piece on Prince of Tides, but I didn't know exactly what. So in January 2004, I was interviewing Pat, right? Pat, my friend, but I said, Pat, let's talk about this text, the Prince of Tides. And so in the course of this interview, Pat told me the most fascinating thing I could have imagined. You know how autobiographical Pat Conroy is in his work. Pat says, Malphrus, which is what he always called him, Luke Wingo is the only character in that book that has no direct correlation to anybody I know. He is not based on anybody I know. He is a total fabrication. He is a total... Now, we could talk lots, and I've thought a fair amount about who Luke Wingo is to Pat Conroy. What part of Pat Conroy is able to become the hero who acts, you know, this alter ego. I think there's lots that we could say and do and think about that. But I find that incredibly fascinating. And so when Pat told me that, that is what caused me to zero in on Luke Wingo specifically and do my next reread of the book with Luke Wingo in mind. Okay, what else? Yes?
I wonder if you have any insight. I was an early reader of his, in that I was always waiting for his next book to come out.
Yes.
So I had read the first ones, and they all made sense to me based on his life experience, that those would be novels that he would write, and of course Waters writes. So then Prince of Tides, which I'd been waiting for. I mean, I'd heard it was coming out, it seems such a departure, and it's such a perfect book. It's like, I don't know. Well, do you have any understanding of what inspired that?
I'll give you my 2 cents. So, The Water is Wide, memoir, based on his experience teaching on Defusky. The Great Santini, obviously with close ties to family, with his father, the fighter pilot, with characters based on his family. The Lords of Discipline, based on a fictionalization of his experience at the Citadel. The characters in this book, they're still the tyrant figure father. Okay, they're still Don Conroy there. I mean, and remember, Henry Wingo, yes, he's a shrimper, but he was fighter pilot too, right? In World War II, you know, we have this other father figure. Lila is another rendition of Lillian, of Peg. You know, these various imaginings, fictionalizations of the emotional truth of Pat's parents. I mean, I certainly believe that the bond of the siblings in this book, even though there are three of them, is the condensed version of Pat's brothers and sisters and their intense and abiding love for one another. So I think it's still the same story. It's certainly the same story of the young male protagonist and some rite of passage kind of, not even necessarily young. I mean, Tom Wingo isn't that young, but he is, coming to grips, is going through various rites and passages they all have through this book. But place also is that. So you got the Citadel, you got that. Then you got the low country of South Carolina that acts so much as character in this book. Let's go back to the opening. My wound is geography. It is also my anchorage. My port of call. I don't know this. Yes. Geography starts, and back to the Prince of Tides. Yes, it's Tom's geography, and it's Savannah's geography. It's everybody. It's Talitha has to come back to the Low Country. Everybody comes back to the Low Country, but it's still the Prince of Tides who is most closely connected to the land. And I love it that Pat begins with those words of Tom Wingo, but it's the Prince of Tides who's the wound. He is the land, just like Arthur is the land. And when the land is sick, when Arthur is sick, the land is sick, right? When the land is suffering, when the land is being robbed from them, Luke suffers. And so my thought is, it's Pat's book, with the focal point of the low country of South Carolina as bigger than protagonist. Yes.
Wasn't he also writing it when he was in Rome?
A lot of this, yes.
Heartsick, having great personal difficulty and trauma, and I kind of imagined him just pining to be here, as he was writing some of it. Some of the language it gives you goosebumps, when you're reading it. Now that I live here and know this place also, So I kind of felt that way about it, because I agree with you. It was, when I read it after reading his other works, I went, where'd this come from?
And this has surely been said,
really poetic, right?
that yearning for the distance from, and the yearning for...
Did he speak about that when you interviewed him about the book?
I don't recall that. I don't recall. I tried to, here lately, thinking about this, and how we might possibly do this in an hour, and thinking about that period where we did talk about the book, I rummaged through a little bit trying to find those notes, and I haven't come across them yet. I'll get back to you. Yes?
What about Bernard? He seems to be a real key character to help Tom through some of the struggles that he's in.
Bernard, and so Bernard and Bernard's mom do a lot to help Coach Wingo regain his self-esteem, right? He has lost that. He has been very much knocked down as a man, as a figure of leadership, getting fired, with self-exile since Luke's death. He has retreated into himself and away from his wife. And so working with Bernard, teaching Bernard, being that leader, that figure deserving of respect to this young man, I agree with you, is along with his, the relationship that develops with Susan, his mother, and her making him feel like a man. I mean, they are definitely on this hero quest, as Campbell describes it. We would list them in the myth as helper figures, both of them.
Do you think Tom's taken on a little bit of Luke's persona in his helping of Bernard? Kind of like Luke was there to help Tom and Savannah, and then Tom kind of took on that persona to help Bernard.
Sure, I can see that. I can see it as a restoration of self. I mean, he has been the teacher. He has been the coach up until he got, that's what he wanted to do. That's what he has done until, here in the last year. But sure, I can see that filling in, taking on, helping fill up some of the empty space left by Luke, by taking on some of those attributes, by acting. We are witnessing him, Tom Wingo, come back to life. I mean, he by his own admission, and he tells us again and again, I'm dead inside. I'm a shell of a man. I am a wash-up. I'm a nobody. I'm a nothing. He's depressed. It's extremely so. And yeah, I like that. I like that thought. What else? Yes?
A strange question. We know that Luke is the Prince of Tides. In the movie, one of the last things Savannah says to Tom before he goes back home is that Tom is the Prince of Tides. And that has bothered me like crazy.
Honey, we can't help about Hollywood.
I know. But I know that in the credits it says Pat worked on the screenplay with Barbra Streisand. And I just wonder why he allowed that to happen. That really bothered me.
Well, I think that goes back to what Kathy said. I don't know that he had much in the way, maybe someone else can speak to this more than I could say, but to my knowledge, that wasn't his call. Yes?
To some degree, Pat's second marriage to Lenore was a troubled time. Does he think that had any influence
On,
the book?
well, I should think that everything in his life, in one way or another, good or bad or otherwise, would have influenced. But I can't speak to that in any specific way. Yeah. Yes?
I love the grandparents. I have to know, were they based on any real characters of life that he knew? Because the grandparents, I love both of them. I mean, they added a little comic relief, but they were also very interesting characters.
Kathy, will you please answer that?
It's been so long since I read the book. I'm going to tell you the truth. I read it one time, and I just don't remember. When Pat would write a book, you would read it really fast to see if your name was in it. It would be like, okay, I can do it.
Okay, but I'm blanking on Grandma's.
Stanny.
Yes, talk about her.
Are you talking about Stanny?
Yes.
Stanny was a real person. Oh, that was my mom's mom. Yeah.
So Pat's grandma was very much a character like Talitha.
Yeah.
Very much a character like Talitha. Amos, I don't know so much. But definitely we've got, and you can read about, Pat has written about this. Yes. Yes, they are wonderful characters. We could go on and on and on. We could dive into Amos and talk about that for a long time, from the dragging of the cross to the water skiing to all of it. And Talitha, this wondrous, horrible woman. Okay? So in the Joseph Campbell hero cycle, you have the universal mother, who is womb and tomb. We certainly see this in Lila. We have Lila who gives them magic. Lila who creates the imaginative Savannah the poet, and who gives Luke this ability to narrate this story to us with such beautiful lyricism. Okay? Lila who teaches them about the flora and fauna of Melrose Island and makes things wondrous. Lila who sells them out. Lila who in the end becomes far more archetypally villainous than Henry Wingo could ever dream of being. Henry Wingo didn't dream to be villainous. He was just a son of a bitch. He was a violent man who abused his children, and that heartbreaking point where we find out that in part he was like he was because he didn't want to be like his father, a weak man whose wife left him. And that's what I mean about Talitha, this wonderful, I love this woman, 3 laps around the world in 3 years, independence, doing what she did. It's wonderful, except for the fact that she left this little boy at home motherless. Okay? It's hard to come to terms with that. At that young age, she abandoned Henry Wingo. And Henry Wingo, in an attempt to make sure that Lila never left him, felt that he needed to be strong. Well, how he showed strength clearly was overboard, to say the very least, but that is where that grew out of. So all these characters in their wonderful, larger than life, I mean, theater of the absurd, the whole book is theater of the absurd. There is that complexity. It's not just that Talitha's the grand wanderlust woman who comes home with the fabulous souvenirs and tales. She has been rounded out. You know, Amos is they're all. You know, Pat does this beautiful thing in this book where we start out and we hate Henry Wingo's, as we should. This horrid, abusive man. And we feel closer to Lila, the magic creator. And somewhere along the way, about midpoint, we get to see Henry Wingo aboard Miss Lila and see that he's a different man on the water. There's no violence on that shrimp boat. There's no ugliness. He is a good father there. It's along about halfway that in that same set of chapters we see Henry not just as tyrant monster, but as schmuck. The guy who comes up with all these get-rich-quick schemes, or maybe even not so quick. The guy who buys that service station, the one on that corner. You all know that corner. If you grew up in a small town, or maybe not even that small, you know that corner where nothing's going to make it. That restaurant that opens, closes, and another one folds, and the next one after that. And the same thing with service stations. But Henry did it. And so we little by little begin to open ourselves up to this bad man as a more sympathetic character. It's masterful what Conroy is doing there with the narrative, with causing us little by little to have to recognize the humanity in this monster. This man who was once a little boy abandoned by his mother. And at the same time, we get this subtle shift that Pat starts to do with Lila trying. We feel for her wanting to be part of the Colleton League, you know, and that her recipe gets dissed and all this kind of stuff. But we begin to see her and how she operates. And we witness her humiliate Henry. We're happy for it at first. We love it when he eats that dog food. That's one of my favorite scenes in this book, okay? But she humiliates him and he's trying, then Pat's amping up the empathy that we begin to tiny increments, incrementally tiny, and begin to lose for her, so that by the time the book ends and she has done the unforgivable thing, sold out the homeland, created the death of her son, and on, she becomes the villain far greater. By the time the book is done, Henry's out of the pokey. Henry's going to be a good granddad. We see the reenactment of the Great Santini. We see the reenactment of Don Conroy, back to the familial, connections to this book. So we could talk about that. We could talk about, we could pull way away from our local connections and so on and talk about narratively what he's done. But what else shall we talk about now in the time we have left? Who else has a thought or a question? An observation that you've been hoping that we would touch on.
Was Melroy Island a real place, or is it Melrose?
Melrose.
Yeah,
Melrose.
fictional.
Melrose, as far as I know, is a fictionalized version of one of a number of these hammocks, we call them here in the Low Country, small islands in the marshlands, not in the rivers, not far offshore. Melrose, of course, is one of the many local place names, not local to right here, but there's Melrose. It's one of the sections of Defusky, just like Colleton that we're calling Beaufort, our neighboring Colleton County, and so on. He started doing this in as early as the water is wide, when he called Defusky Yamacraw Island. Yamacraw being an Indian name. He does that with the geographical names. People found Beaufort anyway, though. He did. Maybe perhaps some of you. Anybody in here influenced to make the pilgrimage and stay because of that? I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It was the reason.
6.
It was my reason too.
That's why we came to look.
Came to look and stayed.
You were asking about observations, and we're talking about Lila. I love the way that he slowly showed us her machinations in terms of how, especially when she was taking care of Reese's wife. I mean, I was just like, oh my God. But the image of the houses going down the river on the barges, I mean, being sold down the river kind of thing, I was like, priceless. And I mean, I knew the story of Ellerton, and when I first read the book, I didn't. So, coming back to it, knowing more about the area and the history, but you just see the whole image of just those Bay Street mansions to the Street of Tides.
Yes.
going down the river, I just thought was a great touch.
Yes. Yes. So back to those true life things. Some of you may not know, who aren't from around here, that this thing that happens fictionally in this book of Colleton, the town being dismantled, abandoned for this nuclear power plant to take over, is very much based on just up the road toward Barnwell, Savannah River site that those of us who are from here grew up with, and it was always this scary, you can drive through it, with all these signs, don't stop, don't, it was a villainous place, and to know that this town, Ellington, I'm Ellen, so this is to me, and now there's New Ellington, right, because they've dug up the graves, and they have eviscerated the town. Clearly it made that impact on Pat, but the houses going down the river, this is something I want to check on. The Strawn Mansion on Defusky, where we have been of late, was, some of you remember this too, that house was taken from St. Simon's down the river. It was quite a sight to see, that house coming down the river. That happened in 1986. Rereading The Prince of Tides this time and having the Straw Mansion in my mind has caused me to want to go back and research. What I can't remember about the Straw Mansion is how long we had anticipated. Had this been several years that they were talking about moving this place to Defusky? And if so, did that work its way into Pat's mind and manifest itself with that scene of those Bay Street mansions heading down the river? Or it happened in 1986. What month did The Prince of Tides come out? Did those corporate people read The Prince of Tides and think, yes, we're going to get ourselves a mansion and we're going to float it down the river? I'm fascinated with this question. I look forward. I will get back to you because I can't wait to know the answer.
Well,
Yes.
I have two things too, except I've already forgotten the second one. But I was out on Defusky recently and stayed in that Melrose Place, the defunct neighborhood.
Yes.
But when his books first came out, then that brought some popularity and some fame to this area. I wonder if even Melrose Place, when the developers named Melrose Place, it wasn't from this book.
I believe that on the old plats,
It was still called Melrose.
that was one of the early place names
Okay,
on
then I
Defusky.
remember the second thing. He also would have been aware maybe of the houses moved from Paris Island to Pigeon Point on barges. And that's houses, not big houses, but
Okay.
houses going
Okay.
down the river.
Okay.
When were those houses moved?
I really don't know.
See,
the
that's
year, but
something I don't
when
know
Pigeon
about.
Point started,
Right.
Yes. Okay.
probably in the 60s, I would
So
think.
you would have known about
Movies.
it.
Yeah.
Well, the
Maybe.
Malphrus Corporation was formed in 1984 on Hilton Head,
Mhm.
and when we first got married and was on Hilton Head, I worked for a bank over there who did lots of loans for Sea Pines and Charles Fraser and Malphrus Corporation,
Mhm.
so this came out after that, so maybe he had
This
some
was
connection with Melrose, I don't know.
Hearing the names, reading them in the newspaper, it has a ring. Melrose has a nice ring to
And
it.
And
the
it's
Prince
on
of
the
Tides was filmed, that house is on the end of Bay Street.
Sure.
We still have a contract at our school where we leased out the crystal that's used in the movie.
Yes, there are lots of good movie stories for sure. What else?
Well, I have a good story that I've been waiting for a crowd to tell us too. But I went to see. Did you just say, "Oh Lord"?
Gather around, we'll be here for a
Well, no,
while.
but I got to tell Pat Conroy this, and I said, this will only take 1 minute, but I can make it take longer. But I got to tell him at his birthday party at the Arsenal, and he said, I like that story. But what brought us here was my husband was a Navy pilot, and he was stationed in Naples, Italy. And so we went to the base theater, we sat and watched on wooden chairs, The Water is Wide, Conroy. And then, I'm getting emotional. And then this is why I'm emotional. Then I went straight up to the Naval Hospital and had my first baby that night. From Conrack, seeing all the beautiful low country scenes, and we knew we were coming back to live in the Atlanta area. And I said, I want to live there someday.
And what did you name your child?
Wow.
Conroy.
And is this child's name Conroy? What? Did you name the child Conroy?
But you wanted.
No, I didn't. No, it wasn't that. But it was just that I look back and I remember the last thing. As not a mother, I went straight up and had him that night.
We wanted to know if you named him Pat, that's what we were wondering.
No, I don't know. There were too many Pats in the Donovan family, so
That's a good story.
yeah. And that's what he said.
Do you think Luke committed suicide?
Well, you can call it suicide. I think that Luke was very much aware that he would not be leaving Melrose. I don't think of it as suicide. I think of it as
The inevitable, maybe?
yes, I think that's a very good way to put it. The inevitable. The inevitable. Yes.
Sorry to be a downer. That's kind of been bothering me. You mentioned that you were bothered by a line. Luke's death has always
Yes.
bothered me.
Luke and Caesar.
Yes. Oh, Caesar
You think
was a
that
problem.
bothers you? What about me? I'm going to leave here talking for an hour about the Prince of Tides and have messed up my wound is geography.
It was right behind you. We could read it.
Yes.
I've got a story that probably nobody here would have heard. A friend of mine was working in early 90s as a police officer for the city of Beaufort. He was driving down Rebo Road. He saw this white Mustang convertible with this woman with the flowing hair thing going on. He looks in his rearview mirror and the car has no license plate. So being a police officer, he turns around, he pulls her over, finds out she doesn't have an insurance card, registration, or even a driver's license. She says, "Don't you know who I am?" And he said, "Yeah, you're the woman I just pulled over, no license plate, registration." It was Barbara Streisand. She's driving the stock car they were using in the movie to drive over the McTier Bridge. When they were melted at the very end of the movie. And so she gets on her cell phone, this is early 90s, she calls her manager calls chief of police calls my friend, on the radio says, "Let her go, don't you know who that is?" "Yeah, that's the woman who has no driver's license." And he had to let her go.
That's good.
It is.
All right, folks, yes?
Just an observation. Every time I come over the Harbor Island Bridge, I live on Fripp, Pat's words live in that marsh, in that area. And there's no way I can ride around this area without thanking him for capturing the beauty.
Oh, yeah.
No question.
I think many feel that way. I think many people who did not grow up in the low country of South Carolina, and even those who did, who came to see their home place in a different way through his work. That's lovely. And now you're a Cumia, right? You're one of the...
You're coming.
I'm a company,
Cumia.
yes.
That's wonderful.
And the Harbor Bridge is right near the Story River,
Yes.
which is a channel, which is what he named his book venture after. So
Yes.
it's right there on the
Yes.
Story River.
Right. Yes. This book is one of those. It's a Story River book. Indeed. Indeed. Yes.
I'm a docent here, and many people come from far away that have never been to Beaufort before, but they say when they drive in, like from 95, and they first come to the marshes, it's like their home. It's like they've seen it 1,000 times, and they feel right at home as they drive in. I've heard that over and over and over again.
Because of reading?
Because of
about it,
reading,
or
and
seeing?
he paints such beautiful pictures in their minds that when they actually get here, they've seen it, which is quite a compliment.
Yes, it certainly is. Yes, it's. I mean, let's face it. Our Prince of Scribes is the guy who writes about the low country of South Carolina with more lyrical power than anybody has, or I would venture to say will. I think that's the truth. It's great to know that so many share that. Yes. Last say, anyone? Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.